Hello everyone and welcome to my Custodian Guard video tutorial series, going through how I like to paint the custodes. So diving straight into it, starting off with scale 75 and dwarven gold. Now just beware to make sure that you have plenty of ventilation whilst using your airbrush. If you need to, wear a mask as well. Now we're thinning all these paints down with about 75% paint to 25% thinner. Now this scale 75 dwarven gold is going to go over all of the golden areas, and we're going to try to keep it as thin and as flat as possible to ensure good coverage with no build up and no spider legging of the paint. It's going to go over every golden area, and then we're going to build it up into further colours from there. You can see I've applied a couple of coats to ensure that I've got a very smooth finish across the whole of the miniature, wherever there is going to be golden part of the model. Thinning wise, with my water-based paints, I use a Vallejo airbrush thinner to thin them down. If I'm using Tamiya paints, I will always use Tamiya thinners. Now moving on, the first stage of highlights. So we're going to use scale 75 dwarven gold and citrine alchemy in a 50-50 mix, and this is going to be a broad application to the rough areas where light is going to be hitting the surfaces. Now this is more of a sketch, and it's all going to be further refined as we go through to with paintbrushes to force all of those highlights and shadows in. Bearing in mind, when we are working on a polished finished armour, we are essentially forcing fake highlights and fake shadows into flat surfaces, which is kind of boggling on the eye to think of, boggling on the brain even, to think of where they're going to go. But actually, hopefully, using the demonstrations that I'm showing during these videos, you'll be able to see exactly where I'm placing the highlights and shadows, and we'll try to give our best explanations of why that's happening. So working from a main light source coming from the top left hand side is going to give us a focus of where we're going to apply all of these highlights onto the model. Flipping it around to back, and imagining that light source is coming from the same direction that we're painting it from. So it's coming from the same angle. However, it's now hitting the rear upper left quadrants of the miniature. Now this is definitely not a zenithal highlight, so the light actually does travel down and around all of those different shapes and values of the armour. It's not just going to be a top illuminated piece, it's going to travel right the way down the surface, really focusing on all of those focal techniques that we've covered in the past, and emphasising those lines of influence. Now, to counter this, what we're going to do is going to use Citadel Contrast Magos Purple, again through the airbrush, so this is more of a sketch of where these shadows are going to go. It's quite acute, but essentially it's coming from the opposite angles of what we applied our highlights, so it's going to come from the bottom right hand side of the miniature, because we've got the light coming from the top left. Now we have got lots and lots of various different contours to take into consideration, because the custodian's armour is almost sculpted to the muscular mass of the person inside it. So you have to take into consideration all of these different shapes and angles when applying this paint, because it won't always be that the whole inside of that leg is going to be shaded to the same value as what other parts of it are. Because of the angles, you're going to get light hitting in certain areas, mid-tones popping out in other areas, and then these shadows are going to creep in the very darkest of them. Generally though, as you saw on the first initial highlight stage, you saw me coming down from the top with my lighting. Now you can see me coming up from the bottom with my shading. I am trying not to skip too much because I want to get everybody to see exactly where I'm putting these shadows in. It's going to follow all the way through this video. It may seem quite long, but actually it should give you quite a good idea of exactly where all of those shadows and highlights are going into. Because it's not like a normal Astartes armour, which is very singular shaped, if you like. It's all lots of flat panels. We have loads and loads of different reflection points that we need to put in because of the fact that it is actually a polished surface of mirrored gold that we are painting. So you can see very, very smooth and controlled minor applications of this paint, and that is because it's all too easy to go overboard. Can't really take that off too easily. However, we can always add more if we've done too little. Alright then, so now we're done with our airbrush, so what we're going to do is we're going to apply a coating of Winsor & Newton Cobalt Violet over the whole of the miniature. This is going to go into all of the little nooks and crannies and pick out all of those recessed details to give us a little bit more emphasis towards the crevices and also those edges on the other side of those crevices. It's going to pick out all of those super little tiny details. Now, bearing in mind this is not the final application of purple, there will be further application of a different type of purple to go on after this, but this is doing a very, very good job of picking out all of those details for us. You can see that it's pretty thin, and it is very much so a wash that we're using. It's thinned just with white spirits right the way down to consistency of a wash, because we don't want it coming out thick, although we can take it off just with pure spirits to if we did make a mistake. We don't really want to be making that mistake, so we've thinned it right the way down to wash consistency using white spirits to apply all the way over. Now do bear in mind, when using white spirits you want to use a very, very durable pot to mix it in. If you just use cheapy pots, it might dissolve through the pots. So I'm just using a Chinese takeaway box here to mix my paints in. Thoroughly wash out, of course, because we don't want any grease from the Chinese coming out in our paints. So now here we go in with the Citadel Contrast Magos Purple. We're just using this with a paintbrush now. Now what we're doing is we're refining everything that we previously put on. So as you can see, I'm working around that foot. I'm pin washing it into that recess, but up towards the angles, I am glazing it towards those areas that I want the darkest areas to be. So you'll always notice I'm working from the lighter area and going to the darker area with a very, very thinned Magos Purple application. And this is thinned quite heavily down to a wash consistency already in the pot. I do tend to pre-thin my paints before taking them from the pot, but you'll notice I'm building it up and bringing it towards those areas that I want to force those shadows and highlights, because I am making my own shadows and highlights on those mirrored surfaces. So you notice the opposite side of that ridge over the toe, I am really emphasizing the strong point across there. That's going to blend out towards the gold, as we'll see later on. Get some really crazy funky reflections going on across a mirrored surface, but I really want to emphasize this purple into those areas. It's just going on top of what we've already got. We've already sketched it out, and now we're emphasizing it with the paintbrush. There's only so much an airbrush can do. You can't get the levels that you can with a paintbrush with an airbrush, but you can get an overall surface reflection. So you notice how it goes from a dark shadow the opposite side of the ridge line and underneath those recesses, then it goes to a lighter area, then it goes to a darker area, and then it goes to a lighter area again on an area, a surface area that is actually thinner than the tip of a pencil. That's the levels of detail that we're going to go to. Again, picking out all of those deepest recesses, emphasizing those details, and then creating the fake and false shadows that we're putting in to create our mirrored image. Always, the main point you've got to remember is where your light source is coming from while you're doing this. So you can see I'm going into that inside of his left leg because my light source is coming from the top left. Therefore, the inside of that left leg is going to be the darkest area. It's then going to transition to a light point, and then we've got a ridge. So we're going to get a really fine line running up the inside of that ridge to emphasize the fact that you have a hard edge on the armor. So in a very small area, we're going from a contrasting dark point onto a light point and then onto a dark point again. Then that's going to happen exactly the same over the other side of the thigh, as and where we want to create those shadows and those reflections. It's a very difficult thing to master. However, there are loads and loads of reference materials out there. If you look at traditional artists using non-metal metallic techniques, or if you look at other people like my pieces, I always do this sort of thing, and I always have loads and loads of pictures out there that you can utilize as source images to be able to work out where you're going to put your lights and shadows. A really good thing to use, even though, as I've noticed, Games Workshop don't really do this sort of thing on their miniatures, on sit-stand miniatures. If you just have a look at a standard Custodian Guard miniature taken from their range, you can work out where these shadows are going to go just by utilising the photography. So if you pick one little armour panel and then look at the picture that they've taken of it, zoom in on that little part of the armour, and you can see exactly where the light is reflecting off of that metallic surface, and then therefore where the shadows are going to be. And that is exactly what I'm doing. I'm emphasising where those shadows would be on this armour. So you can see I'm making all these almost swirly points on the toe cap, and that's because there's plenty of surface area to get loads and loads of contrast and reflections going on, as opposed to it all just being one level of transition up until that centre point and then being darker over the other side. I want to create a lot more interest going on that surface. You will notice though that as it goes up the midpoint of that foot and then onto the shin armour, that the lighter points are corresponding with the lighter points on the next arm panel up. Therefore, the darker areas are also corresponding with the darker panels on the next area up as well. It's almost like lines going up the different armour panels towards their eventual finish point. Again, I'm taking plenty of time to make sure that all of these areas are covered in this video, because it is a really difficult technique to pull off, just because of understanding where all these shadows and lighting points are going to go. So hopefully by watching through these videos, and you can go back over and over and over again, it's not like videos of old that's going to wear the film tape out. It's all digital, so you can go back and watch it all the time, and you can work out exactly where I'm putting those shadows, and then you can put that into your miniatures as well when you're trying to recreate what I'm doing here. Obviously, it's very important to think about making sure that you don't have any tide lines going on, which is why when I'm applying this paint, I am glazing it from the lighter areas into the darker areas and lifting my paintbrush up where those darker areas are, which deposits the most amount of paint pixels, and that is how you get a nice smooth transition going through, as opposed to it being layers of paint that you're putting on, which creates the tide lines. So again, I'm re-emphasising those darker lines underneath the little fine details, the little lightning bolts on the belt buckle. I'm re-emphasising the shadows underneath them, because they are particularly hard to paint, because they are so fine details that if you try and apply lots of different lighting techniques to them, you can often make them look overburdened with too much detail that you're trying to put on. So sometimes it's a little bit easier just to keep it a little bit more simple, emphasise the shadows underneath them, and then let the metallic paint that's already on them bring the reflections off of them to give you the highlights. Okay, so now we're going to bring back in the mid-tone of the Dwarven Gold. Now it's really important to do this and not just jump onto the highlights. If you forget to do this and don't glaze that Dwarven Gold back in, then it can look like you've just got shadows and highlights with no mid-tone in it, and the mid-tone is actually what brings the richness of the gold, that rich, burnished yellow gold armour that we're trying to create on these miniatures. So all I'm doing here is I'm reapplying this Dwarven Gold in a glaze consistency from the shaded area into the mid-tone. I'm not going up onto those highlighted areas, but I'm kind of mixing in between them. If you like, I'm creating a line between the shadow and the light. But it is a blended line, so I've got no blend lines. But like I say, this is just going to bring the richness of that yellow, so that when we go and put on further super refined highlights in the future, there is going to be that difference in between, and it will really make the highlighted areas stand out as focal points and lines of influence, drawing you towards those focal areas of the miniature. All the fundamentals of painting we're taking into consideration, but we really want to make sure that we've still got that mid-tone. Going over with the airbrush earlier on, putting the oil wash over the top, we could have lost some of this mid-tone, and it's always quite important to make sure that mid-tone is there. That is the main colour of the piece overall. So you can see, guys, I'm not being too acute with this this paint application like I will be when I go on to putting on really refined highlights. I'm just getting it in quite a broad area. This is not a highlight stage by any means. This is just getting that main colour in so that we get a little bit of the contrast to the purple, because at the moment it does look very purple over the miniature. Purple's not the colour that we're wanting to achieve. We're utilising the purple to create the contrast in colour, as opposed to using darker versions of gold, just because I'm using a little bit of colour theory, utilising the colour wheel to create interest across the miniature. I don't just want to be like everybody else. I want to make my pieces unique and different and make them stand out because of that. And I utilise the colour wheel and the purple being a contrast in colour to the yellow to create that contrast across the piece. So it is very important to get the yellow back into the miniature. You can see those lines of influence that I was on about, where you've got the ridge going up the centre of the thigh. You've got a very fine application of the purple around it, and that goes on to the mid-tone that we're putting back in here before it goes to the darkest point on the inside of the thigh armour. Multiple reflections across every single surface panel in loads of different ways and loads of different directions, which helps to create that mirrored effect that the golden armour that we're trying to achieve. So this is going to be applied over all of the rest of the miniature, but just make sure you take time to look at those areas to work out exactly where it's gone on over the rest of the miniature. So working on to our next highlight stage. So we're going to use the Scale 75 Dwarven Gold and Citrine Alchemy mix in a 50-50 mix up. And this is going to be our first highlight. So we've already done this through the airbrush, but now we're going to emphasise it with the paintbrush. So at this point we're going to be picking out all of those edge highlights. We're going to work from the mid-tone that we've just reapplied just with the Dwarven Gold, and we're going to work it towards those brightest points. Again, emphasising those lines of influence which are drawing us towards those focal points, and really picking out and accentuating all of those muscular points that would capture the most light. Obviously it's armour, which is kind of mimicking muscular anatomy on the miniature in a custodian way, but we are going to be making sure that those points create those reflections to create that mirrored image. Really important to go around all of the edges on the miniature at this point, otherwise we will lose those edges. We did already have the Dwarven Gold highlight, so we're not going along every single edge all the way to the very end points where it is darkest on the miniature. When we've got a Dwarven Gold edge highlight into those darkest areas, we're going to leave that, and then we're going to create a transition from that edge highlight of Dwarven Gold up to this mixture, so we get a contrasting and lightening, if that's even a word, a line that's getting lighter from one point to another point, to show that is really forcing that highlight up that edge, just like it is across the rest of the armour. So all about these attention to details. Every single custodian is supposed to be just like the most heroic person in the whole of the Imperium. Every single one of them a super character unto themselves. So we want to really emphasise that. All of these miniatures are going to be painted to the absolute maximum that we possibly can, creating an absolutely stunning army, but also individual centerpieces that we can put on display as well. So we're capturing the opposite side of this this circle here. It's actually really interesting. When I won my my gold at Golden Demon with my Suzerain squad, one of the bits of feedback, great bit of feedback that I got, was that because I was concentrating so much on a singular point of light, hitting the miniature, where it was hitting the top of the shield and it was therefore lightest at the top of the shield, I left the bottom side of the shield darker, and that kind of lost the shape, the circulature and the oval shape of the shield itself and the contours of it. One of the biggest things that I was told to do is to get a counter highlight into the bottom side of it to re-emphasise the actual shape of the piece. So across his belt buckle there, you saw me put in a counter reflective highlight into the lower side of it. So hopefully now you're really starting to get a picture of exactly where I'm trying to build the light and the shadows across these armour surfaces and everything that's golden on the armour. We are going to refine this even further with the even higher highlight as we go on to create those spot highlights, but this is the main highlight across the piece. Now it's really important because at the moment you're only seeing one colour on this miniature, which is the gold. When we go on to paint other surfaces, you will see me paint all of those to correspond with everything I've done on the gold as well. So where I've got highlights going into certain pieces from certain directions, I will make sure that I also do that on the surrounding areas, which helps to build the picture. If I was to put them on an opposite angle or an opposite piece to the surrounding surfaces, then we are not going to see that picture building up. You'll get to see this as we do further colours as we go through the miniature. Okay, so now we're really pushing and refining these edges. So now we're just using Scale 75 Citrine Alchemy. And like I say, we are really emphasising these. These are going on to the sharpest points of those highlights, across those edges where the largest amount is of light is striking them. And we're doing everything to build onto those lines of influence, those focal points that we want everybody to look at. Now, inadvertently, people are not realising that they are looking at certain areas, but actually we really are drawing them to where we want them to look at. So these spot highlights, if you like, are not going completely over the previous stage of highlight that we've already done. What they are doing is they're going right at those refining and defining points of those highlights that we've already applied. These are, as the word says, spot highlights. They are the absolute focal point of that area, which is really, really pushing you towards the where you want to look. They are the strongest point of reflection. So on things like this, guys, it is super important to not leave any little details. Every single thing needs to be picked out. These are absolute artisans and works of art when it comes to suits of armour. So we need to make sure we pick out everything. And that draws this video to an end. And I look forward to seeing you when we go into the next video on the silver details. So, thank you very much, guys. See you soon.